this story almost a week now. Believe it or not, it was on NPR. And it's a story that's never told about the ghettos in America. So I want to tell you this story about ghettos in America. We hear the liberals talk all the time, right? About we have these segregated communities in the inner cities. We don't use the word ghetto anymore, but ghetto is a perfectly legitimate word, and I will not be censured and told what words we can and cannot use that are in fact legitimate words. Believe it or not, this was on NPR. Historian says don't sanitize how our government created ghettos. He means the modern inner city. 50 years after the repeal of Jim Crow, many African Americans still live in segregated ghettos in the country's metropolitan areas. Richard Rothstein, a research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, as far as I know this could be some left-wing Marxist group, doesn't really matter, has spent years studying the history of residential segregation in America. Or it may be a conservative group, again, I don't know. He says we have a myth today that the ghettos in metropolitan areas around the country are what the Supreme Court calls de facto. Just the accident of the fact that people have not enough income to move into middle-class neighborhoods, or because real estate agents steered black and white families to different neighborhoods, or because there was white flight, says Rothstein to NPR. It was not the unintended effort or effect of benign policies, he said. It was an explicit, racially purposeful policy that was pursued at all levels of government. And that's the reason we have these ghettos today, and we are reaping the fruits of those policies, unquote. So let's stop right here. His hypothesis, actually his assertion, based on his years and years of study, is that the government created the modern ghetto. Well, that caught my attention. Does it have your attention? Let's consider. One of the ways in which we forget our history is by sanitizing our language and pretending that these problems don't exist. We've always recognized that there were ghettos. A ghetto is, as he defines it, a neighborhood which is homogeneous and from which there are serious barriers to exit. That's the technical definition of a ghetto. Robert Weaver, the first African-American member of the cabinet appointed by President Johnson as his Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, described many of the policies that this fellow describes today in a book he published in 1948 called The Negro Ghetto. The Kerner Commission referred to the ghetto. This is a term that we no longer use because we're embarrassed to talk about it. And we need to confront our history, this is the professor, and stop sanitizing our language and talk openly about what we've done as a nation and what we need to do to undo it. He goes on. He goes on and he says, it's a policy. Well, actually, let me do this. He says, and we can't talk openly if we're going to use euphemisms instead of being explicit about what the reality is. On how the New Deal's Public Works Administration led to the creation of segregated ghettos. Let me repeat this. On how the New Deal's Public Works Administration, the PWA, led to the creation of segregated ghettos, he says, its policy was that public housing could be used only to house people of the same race as the neighborhood in which it was located. But in fact, most of the public housing that was built in the early years was built in integrated neighborhoods, which they raised and then built segregated public housing in those neighborhoods. So public housing created racial segregation where none existed before. That was one of the chief policies. Wow. And I thought we were supposed to celebrate FDR, the progressives, and the New Deal. On the Federal Housing Administration's overtly racist policies in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, he says the second policy, which was probably even more effective in segregating metropolitan areas, was the Federal Housing Administration. You've heard of the FHA, right? Which financed mass production builders of subdivisions starting in the 30s and then going on into the 40s and 50s in which those mass production builders, places like Levittown, for example, Nassau County, New York, and in every metropolitan area in the country, the FHA gave builders like Levitt concessionary loans through banks because they guaranteed loans at lower interest rates for banks, and the developers could use to build these subdivisions on the condition that no homes in those subdivisions be sold to African Americans. Your ears should be ringing. This is New Deal, progressive, federal policy. In the ghetto, government policy, municipal policy, for example, denied adequate services, garbage wasn't collected frequently, African Americans were crowded into neighborhoods in the ghetto because so much other housing was closed to them as a result. Housing prices in ghettos were much higher than similar housing in white areas. Rents were much higher than similar housing in white areas because you had a smaller supply. It's the basic laws of supply and demand. So this created slum conditions. So when African Americans managed to break out of those slums and buy a home in a neighboring area, whites could be persuaded that slum conditions were going to be brought into their neighborhood. So the real estate agents at the time would go into these neighborhoods and try to panic white families into selling their homes cheap to the real estate agents. And they in turn would flip these homes to African Americans at a higher price. This was all started in the 30s under FDR and the New Deal. This was all started for the purpose of taking integrated inner city neighborhoods and creating segregation through federal spending and federal policies, federal bureaucracies, and federal departments. This is the first I heard of this, and I read a hell of a lot and I study a hell of a lot. Is it the first you've heard of this? No, this story's a week old. Has anybody else even discussed it? Has this been on television anywhere, on any cable program? You see, ladies and gentlemen, as we discuss often on this program, you and I, so much about American history that is wonderful is rejected, is twisted, is attacked. And yet so much about American history that is so awful is celebrated. The New Deal did enormous damage to this country. It did enormous damage to our constitutional system. It did enormous damage to private property rights and capitalism. Oh yes, it created Social Security. Social Security today doesn't look like anything it did when it was first created. Same with several of these other programs. But spending as it is, you would assume that some people are going to benefit from it, so that's a given. But that said, the New Deal was not some brilliant idea that got us out of a depression. And we've talked about this before. There was a recession, a bad recession. And because Herbert Hoover, a liberal Republican, oh, well, he had an executive business experience. As I said, a liberal Republican. And Franklin Roosevelt, a liberal Democrat, because the two of them would not allow the market system to actually work, because the Federal Reserve, even at its early life, in its early years, created tight money when it should have just stabilized the dollar. Government brings down the economy, and out of that is born the New Deal, and out of the New Deal is born segregated metropolitan areas as a matter of policy, as a matter of the left's agenda. I keep talking about how the Democrat Party has done so much damage to black people in this country. How the Democrat Party got its strength, its early strength, from slavery, then segregation, then opposition to voting rights, opposition to civil rights. It is important to know the truth that 50 years after the repeal of Jim Crow, many black people still live in segregated ghettos in America, most of our metropolitan areas. So Richard Rothstein, research associate at the Economic Policy Institute, who has studied this more than anybody else, says that the federal government created these ghettos through its housing policies, through its funding policies, through its subsidy policies. It created ghettos in formally integrated neighborhoods. Don't forget it. I'll be right back.
Mark Levin.
Good afternoon from the Lincoln Memorial in Washington. You are about to hear an address by the President of the United States as he speaks before the closing session of the 38th Annual Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Several thousand persons have gathered in this picturesque setting between the Lincoln Memorial and the reflecting pools looking toward the towering Washington Monument. Mr. Truman will be introduced this afternoon by Mr. Walter White, Secretary of the Association. The next voice you hear will be that of Mr. White.
Ladies and gentlemen, many thousands are here today at the seat of Abraham Lincoln in Washington. I am told that between 30 and 40 million other Americans may be listening to the radio at this hour. Countless other millions listen overseas via shortwave broadcast. We are gathered together because of our deep concern for human rights. This is in great contrast to another meeting on Lincoln's birthday in 1909, 38 years ago. Then there were but a handful, men and women, white and Negro. They had been moved to meet by a southern white man who had just returned from Springfield, Illinois, Abe Lincoln's old home. There this man, the late William English Wallace, had witnessed and written about a bloody race riot. He couldn't take it, just as you and I can't take it today. He felt something had to be done about race, hate, and violence, just as you and I feel something must be done right now. That day, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People began. Pessimists say the race question is insoluble. Insoluble? See what has been done in a single generation. 600,000 Americans, Negro and white, are banded together in 1,509 branches of the NAACP. They have helped to work a quiet, bloodless revolution in public opinion on this question. Although that change is sometimes obscured by the shocking acquittal of self-confessed lynchers in South Carolina, or by obscenities of speech and action on the floor of the Congress. Let's look at the record. In a government of laws, the chief bulwark of freedom for the oppressed is the court. Negroes know all too well that there's many a slip between law and living. But during its 38 years, the NAACP has taken to the United States Supreme Court 24 cases involving fundamental human and citizenship rights. It has won 22. As a result, every American, white as well as Negro, is assured a fair trial in a court not dominated by a mob. No man can legally be denied the right to vote in a primary election because of his color, although there still are some who would deny that right despite the Supreme Court and the Constitution. No man or woman because of color can legally be denied equal education in tax-supported schools. Every man, regardless of race, is legally entitled to first-class travel accommodation in return for payment of first-class fare. No labor union can legally deny a man the right to work by excluding him because of color. Substantial progress has been made in gaining court decisions requiring equality. But it is the Association's conviction and contention that there will never be complete equality until the courts and America abandon the myth of separate but equal accommodation. None of us is naive enough to believe that court decisions or legislation by themselves are enough. But legal action and law set the pattern both in restraining the lawless and in the education of decent public opinion. The NAACP came into being 38 years ago because decent Americans just could not take the evils of mob violence and racial bigotry. We carry on today because we just can't take the gouging out of the eyes of a Negro War veteran by South Carolina policeman who was speedily set free. We just can't take the acquittal of men who have taken the law into their own hands and thereby lynched not only American citizens but the law as well. We just can't take the denial to any American citizen of the right to work, to vote, to live outside of ghettos, to share the privileges as well as the responsibilities of citizenship solely because of the color of his skin. The NAACP operates on the proved principle that no nation can exist half free, half slave. We know that throughout history, bigots have grown powerful by first attacking the most vulnerable minority in a nation, and then proceeding to attack others, until liberty was destroyed for everybody, including the bigots. Hitler did that in Germany. Mussolini did it in Italy. Racist bigots, backed by selfish and frightened economic groups, are attempting to set race against race, creed against creed, class against class in America today. They must not, they will not be permitted to succeed.
Great big expression. Boy, you could
we ask you, gentlemen,
with a dozen roses,
that although the stories of lynching and denial of justice to Americans because of race, creed, or national
joy of children laughing,
these outrages do not represent the majority of American citizens. We confess to our
it is
shame
true,
that ours
the
is not an
making
imperfect democracy. We have evil faults, but this great assemblage of American citizens and the presence of the President of the United States,
it's been a miracle.
and of the distinguished Republican
But
Senator
what
from
you've
Oregon,
done, please stay right by my side. Two can be one, the righteous
we
way
are
to
resolved
go.
to make our nation truly a government of the people, by the people, and for
Or
the people.
believe
We know full well that what is done here in
You're
America
second
has
to
a far-reaching effect upon the fortunes and aspirations
love
of
of all
the
mankind.
world whose skins are colored.
should reflect some
NAACP has
sense
done its work not by
of the
knowledge, but by the
words
voluntary
that
contributions of
try
thousands of Americans.
their
White
clothes
as
would
well as
not
Negroes who want to make democracy new. We are proud that our national office is housed in the Wonderful Memorial
describing
Building,
the making
dedicated to the memory of a great American who fought for freedom for all men everywhere. No political party has ever been permitted or ever will be permitted to influence the association policy. We firmly believe that our way of life can be destroyed only from within and not from without. If we as Americans assure that no man is denied any right of citizenship because he is God of skin or worshipped his God in a different place or was born elsewhere, then democracy can never be destroyed. But we also know that human freedom must be in the hearts of men and not solely on paper. With this high objective, today we dedicate our efforts. We welcome to the struggle, whose outcome we hope to determine the future of mankind. Every citizen who believes that the Bill of Rights means what it says. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Mr. Chairman, Mrs. Roosevelt, Senator Morris, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am happy to be present at the closing session of the 38th
Conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The occasion of meeting with you here at the Lincoln Memorial affords me the opportunity to congratulate the association upon its effective work for the improvement of our democratic processes. I should like to talk to you briefly about civil rights and human freedom. It is my deep conviction that we have reached a turning point in the long history of our country's efforts to guarantee freedom and equality to all our citizens. Recent events in the United States and abroad have made us realize that it is more important today than ever before to ensure that all Americans enjoy these rights. When I say all Americans, I mean all Americans. The civil rights law written in the early years of our republic and the traditions which have been built upon them are precious to us. Those laws were drawn up with the memory still fresh in men's minds of the tyranny of an absentee government. They were written to protect the citizens against any possible tyrannical act by the new government in this country. But we cannot be content with a civil liberties program which emphasizes only the need of protection against the possibility of tyranny by the government. We cannot stop there. We must keep moving forward with new concepts of civil rights to safeguard